chairperson of the board of the governors of the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. He has a Master of Science degree in Financial Economics and a postgraduate diploma in Economic Principles from the University of London, as well as a diploma in Political Science from the Institute of Social Sciences in Moscow. He was recently awarded an honorary doctorate by the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University in December 2021. He is a visiting professor at the Wits School of Governance. Before his retirement in 2009, he served in the government as head of communications in the President Mandela's office, CEO of the government communications, and head of the policy unit in the presidency. He was also a member of the First National Planning Commission and is a non-executive director of the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research and Life Healthcare Group. He has been a member of the National Executive Committee of the ANC since 1991. Over to you, Edie.
There was no need, Nqobile, for that long introduction to save time. But I should say it's a great pleasure and honor to welcome all participants at this launch of MISTRA's publication, which is on a just transition to a low carbon future in South Africa. Our profound gratitude is extended particularly to Minister Barbara Creecy, who has made time to join us this morning. In 2015, for those who have been following MISTRA, the Mapungubwe Institute released a publication on the green economy, which was entitled Earth, Wind, and Fire. And this was less about creativity, but more a reflection of the age, profile, and the musical preferences of MISTRA's team at the time. We sought then to unpack the political, economic, and security implications of discourse on the green economy. Today, definite global consensus has been reached that climate change is an existential threat for flora and fauna alike. And a critical element in the discourse is about the disastrous impact of global warming on the poor. However, depending on how it is handled, the transition to a low carbon future can itself further worsen the conditions of life of the marginalized. It is therefore necessary to go beyond technicist ecological interventions to a broader transdisciplinary approach to this challenge. The notion of a just transition has arisen against this backdrop, originating within the trade union movement and finding resonance among those advocating for common but differentiated responsibility. South Africa is in the midst of such debate, made the more urgent by COVID-19. This book proceeds from the premise that South Africa's economic structure, its political system, and broader social relations all come into play in charting the path to a low carbon future. The authors argue that South Africa should use this opportunity to build a green minerals energy complex. Extraction of minerals will of course continue, and South Africa has endowments that are important for green technologies, such as PGMs, manganese, cobalt, and nickel. Unlike in the past, a significant part of these minerals can be processed within the country for domestic and global use. The development of the hydrogen economy, for instance, will require bold practical actions in line with the Hydrogen Society Roadmap launched by government last week. In other words, a just transition should be about an industrial strategy, combining investments and broad-based empowerment that includes skills development. The book cautions about the danger of powerful forces seeking to subsume low-carbon efforts to the pursuit of large profits and climate diplomacy, which is premised on selfish geopolitical interests. It also warns against the warped logic that current carbon-intensive jobs can be preserved at the expense of humanity's future. Required, rather, are broad partnerships with government, investors, workers, and communities, all part of the effort. Spatially, local government will have an important role to play, as will complementary continental efforts in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And of course, the decarbonization of electricity generation, especially in Mpumalanga province, will require focused attention. What about transition finance? It is understandable that they should be focused on coal-gobbling Eskom and the energy sector. But just transition finance should apply to the whole project of green industrialization, and hype should not be allowed to substitute for objective analysis of the structure of funding and of the conditionalities and costs that are attached to its various components. So the main message of the book is that the transition to a low carbon society is possible, but it can only succeed if it is just and handled collaboratively. MISTRA wishes to thank the authors, editors, the peer reviewers, and coordinators who are responsible for this volume, as well as those who contribute to the Institute's sustenance. And this includes in particular the Department of Science and Innovation, which has supported this project. And so, colleagues, you are all welcome, and we hope you will enjoy this engagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edie, for the warm welcome. And indeed, a common thread across the chapters on this book is that the transition should be a people-centered one, and it should prioritize the people of South Africa for it to work for us all. Next on the program, we'll get to hear from my co-editor, Salim Fakai, about, he will give us an overview of the book. Salim Fakai is an executive director of the African Climate Foundation. Prior to establishing the ACF, Salim served as the head of the Policy and Futures Unit of the Worldwide Fund, South Africa, for 11 years. Salim has worked as a senior lecturer at the Department of Public Administration and Planning and as an associate director for the Center of Renewable and Sustainable Energy at Stellenbosch University. Before that, he served as the director for the World Conservation Unit for 8 years. Salim has served on a number of boards and is a prolific writer who contributes regularly to leading South African publications like Engineering News, Business Day, and Daily Maverick. Over to you, Salim.
Thank you very much, Nkobeli. Just to also acknowledge the Honourable Minister of Environment, Barbara Creecy, for participating today. A really pleasure to have her here, and also to acknowledge Joe and the great work that MISTRA has done. I have to admit, a large part of this success has to be attributed to the very hard work of Nkobeli and the MISTRA team. I don't think I, as a co-editor, would have been able to do this without their enormous support behind the scenes. And also special thanks to the authors who have contributed to the various chapters of this book. They came to the party and under lots of different ways of persuading them. They have really stuck to time and helped us to pull the book together. So it's really a collective effort. My job and that of Nkobeli was really to guide the process and to make sure that we were able to produce something that is, I hope, seminal and also an enormous intellectual contribution to a vast area of work that is already developed in the country and is ongoing. I don't want to be long. I just want to say a few remarks to put the book in context and then hand over to the minister. One of the things we wanted to achieve in the book is to bring a collection of thinking from diverse people. Didn't matter what their ideological backgrounds were, or how they thought about the economy, or how they thought about the issue in general, but really just to allow a platform of diverse views to be put on the table in a consolidated compendium in order to make sure that the broader, not only intellectual community and decision makers, but general South Africans who are interested, and even international audience who are interested in these issues, can begin to see the level of richness that has already gone into thinking about the just transition in South Africa. And so we are not new to this. In fact, the just transition is part of the South African NDC. It's been really championed by South Africa in the international arena. And we are actually demonstrating that we can also turn the just transition from a concept to an actual proposition to attract climate finance, to really put investments in new kinds of clean energy infrastructure. And hopefully that will not only transform and diversify the energy sector, but also stimulate growth and development in the economy. And more importantly, to ensure that the social justice aspects of the just transition are captured. There's also, we're drawing on work of the National Planning Commission, which has been done before. We should acknowledge that has been a very important piece of work. And then the ongoing work of the Presidential Commission, which came out of the Job Summit. I think what the book also tries to do is to bring, not get the usual suspects to write, including myself, but get a new group of people that would traditionally not write about this, but who have grounded experience. Sorry, is that okay? Who have grounded experience and to surface their own intellectual work in the sector, which can often be hidden from public view. So we've encouraged them to also be part of this discussion, and many of them are young and also thinking around these issues in a very thorough and rigorous way. And we have them, and some of them will be speaking today, and hopefully have been writing op-eds on their own chapters as we've gone along. I want to pick up on what I think are 4 themes running through the book. The one is that the just transition really brings into the forefront the nature of climate issues, not simply as a narrow environmental issue, but having intrinsically now being intertwined with the development and economic agenda of any country in the world that is looking at what the energy mix looks like today and what it should look like in the future. And so the just transition is really about a transformative issue that is beyond just projects, but also about structural change. And we try to capture diverse views around the question of this structural change in the light of the fact that South Africa has a high dependency on coal, its own utility is highly indebted, and it has had a renewables program that was fairly successful, and it's the largest renewables program on the continent and will continue to be so. These have important implications for the economy, growth, and for jobs in the future, in that we are opening up the vista of incorporating new technology in the energy sector that has ramifications for the rest of the economy. So we try to get people to write about that and to help us understand what those implications are, both from past experience and what we've learned from that, and what we need to look for in terms of how to manage the transition going forward. And in particular, chapters by Kenneth Creamer and others tries to talk to that. The second area is around that the climate issue is not just about carbon emissions, but it's also fundamentally about long-term energy security and the diversification of the mechanisms for establishing this energy security, and not to rely on a single entity like the state utility, but to actually figure out ways in which energy security can be more decentralized and diversified, and to then try to capture within the domestic economy the benefits of these new energy investments, that we are not simply incorporating them to create markets for foreign investors, but also be able to use them to develop our own capability and capacity in these areas. And we do have an industrialized economy. We need to strengthen it, and we have to build that economy on a new energy model that hopefully gives South Africa more agility in terms of its energy security and being more responsive to a world that is increasingly being decarbonized. And if you carbon intense, you're most likely to be penalized for that. And we have to then also think about this in the light of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. There's a chapter talking about that as well. And so South Africa's own energy transition and its outlook is intertwined with countries bordering us, and we have to take a more regional-wide view on this. And in fact, South Africa's climate diplomacy has been very strident last year. If you consider that President Cyril Ramaphosa played a very important role in the EU-Africa discussions and summit last week, and bringing to the fore the importance of a broader concept of climate diplomacy that is not just confined to discussions in the UNFCCC or the Conference of Parties. So I think that's really important. The third part is the relevance of the just dimension. If we're going to phase coal out, and we have to manage the phase out of coal, we got to replace it with something either equivalent or better than what is there before. And we have to really work at this very hard, and it's a whole society endeavor. It can't just be the role of government or a few players in the private sector. It has to be labor unions, it has to be communities on the ground, and also local government and other players. What we are concerned, and the book tries to capture this, is that you can easily have a just transition that is pro-growth, pro-investment, but not necessarily inclusivity and social justice orientated. So we have to work at this, and hopefully the work of the Presidential Commission will guide us with the various stakeholders on that. And the last part is really around, which is an important part that is often missed on the just transition, is the global political economy around just transition, particularly finance, the demand for new kinds of minerals. And Joel mentioned that we are probably in a new kind of minerals energy complex that is orientated towards green technologies and green industries. And the book tries to capture the strategic competition that is starting between major powers, particularly on the African continent, around decarbonization, being leaders and first movers in this arena of new technology, particularly in the arena of hydrogen. In fact, we talk about hydrogen in the book and the importance of hydrogen in South Africa, given that we have some of the critical minerals, and there's a big push now to build our hydrogen economy. So in summary, I think we try to capture the history from climate science to climate compliance to what we're now talking about is a more economy-wide relationship between climate, the just transition, and its transformative effects. And we have to ground this now in real economy programs that we can deliver the just aspect of the transition, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. So I'd like to leave it at that, Nkobeli. Thank you very much. And I really, once again, want to thank the MISTRA team for doing this. I think I was a mere passenger in this process, and this is my first co-edited book, and it would not have been possible without your support. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Salim, for those kind words. And it was indeed my honor to work with Salim and to borrow from his immense intellect to shape and make this book and concept come to life. I would like to remind the audience to please post any questions you might have on the chat function so that those are addressed along the way. Please remember to post your questions on the chat function so that we can address those along the way. And moving along with the program, we will now move on to the next item, which is an address by the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, Minister Barbara Creecy. She will be giving us insights about the just transition as it unfolds in South Africa. Barbara Creecy is the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. That's only the latest position in an important career. She was previously a member of the Gauteng Provincial Legislature, and then in 2004 she was appointed the Gauteng MEC for Sports, Recreation, Arts and Culture. And in 2009, she took up the post for MEC for Education. The minister holds an honors degree in political science from Wits University and a master's degree in public policy and management from the University of London. Thank you so much, Minister, for being with us today, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Xaba, for that warm welcome, and let me acknowledge Joel Netshitenzhe, the Executive Director of the Mapungubwe Institute, and also Mr. Salim Fakir, Executive Director of the African Climate Foundation, fellow panelists, and all of those of you who are online. Thank you very much for inviting me to the launch of this exciting piece of research today. It's actually quite an honor to speak here and to listen to many of you who would have helped to shape many of the events that have taken place over the last 2.5 years. I thought what I would do today was to just share with you our understanding from the side of the South African government on some of the key issues, but also to share with you the journey on which we have traveled, because I'm really coming here less as an analyst and more as a practitioner in this space. Now, United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, has described the climate emergency as the defining issue of our time, arguing that the shocks resulting from climate change not only damage the environment on which we depend, but they also have the potential to weaken our political, economic, and social systems. Concern for the climate crisis, as we have heard in the introduction today, is no longer confined to multilateral institutions or non-governmental organizations. This year, the World Economic Forum's annual Global Risks Perception Survey identified climate action failure, extreme weather events, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem collapse as the top 3 of the 10 top global risks by severity over the next 10 years. Now, our government, in considering the climate risk in our own context, has identified 2 categories of risk to our society and to our economy. And I think this understanding of the risks is an important starting place for understanding how we come to conceptualize the solutions that need to be put in place. So first of all, as we all know, the first risk is a physical climate risk. Scientific evidence indicates that sub-Saharan Africa is particularly vulnerable to climate change and is warming at twice the average global rate. And what this means is that we already have here in our region an average temperature increase of approximately 2 degrees. Now, apart from temperature increase, climate change also, as we know, causes severe storms, drought, and sea level rise. And these are now posing a threat to our food and our water security, to the built environment, and of course to human and animal health. The second category of risk we face is what we call the transition risk. The global transition to a low carbon economy, as other speakers have said, has already begun, and it will continue. Countries that are investing significantly in low carbon technologies will seek to protect these investments with a range of non-tariff and border tax adjustments. So in our understanding, unless we join the technological transition that is taking place across the globe, our economy risks being left behind, and in due course facing redundancy and or non-competitiveness of our exports and our goods and services that have been produced, all of them with a high carbon footprint. Our research indicates that this transition risk will affect major sectors of our economy, including energy, mining, agriculture, transport, and manufacturing. And for those of you who are skeptical, you need to look no further than the recent decision taken by the European Union to ban the import of motor vehicles with internal combustion engines from 2035. And we all know the important role that our automotive industry plays in terms of manufacturing and job creation in our country. Now, conscious of both the physical and the transition risks, and of course the decision by more than 12 of our major trading partners to achieve a net zero status by 2050 has motivated our country in our National Development Plan to including a commitment to building a low carbon economy and a climate resilient society by 2050. Now, the second aspect that is influencing our work is obviously the fact that as South Africa, we are a signatory to the United Nations Convention on Climate Change and to the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement has 3 goals relating to maintaining and lowering global temperature increase, a financial goal, and a resilience goal. And as a signatory, we have a duty as a country to pursue programs and policies to achieve each of these 3 goals and to consistently report on progress and how we are enhancing our ambition. So over the last 2.5 years, we have steadily put in place the architecture that allows us to pursue these 3 Paris goals. We have revised our nationally determined contribution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and this was submitted to the UNFCCC in October last year. The range of the reduction has at its upper limit a 2-degree temperature increase, and at the lower level, we are aspiring to contribute to ensuring that we only have an average global temperature increase of 1.5 degrees. The climate bill was approved by Cabinet for submission to the National Assembly last year, and the climate bill will entrench in legislation the full architecture relating to the 3 goals that I have laid out for all levels of government. In the meantime, we are working with 7 sectors of our economy to set sectoral emission targets and to research pathways that will allow us to begin to transition those sectors into a low carbon future. And parallel with that, we are setting up the mechanisms that will allow us to monitor the carbon budgets that are given to different sectors of the economy and to different industries, and how we will be able to report on progress in this regard to the United Nations. Now, to enhance domestic financing of the transition, National Treasury has, as you know, introduced a carbon tax. And I must say, we welcome the announcements made by Minister Godongwana yesterday in his budget speech, that by 2026, we are looking at the carbon tax being in the region of $20 a ton, moving towards $30 a ton by 2030. And this policy trajectory for the carbon tax really will be very helpful in allowing us to achieve the nationally determined contribution that we submitted for 2025 and for 2030 to the United Nations in October last year. We have also produced and adopted a national adaptation strategy. And we are working with provinces and municipalities across the country to mainstream climate resilience and to ensure that all the work that will need to be done over the next 10 to 15 years to improve climate resilience is mainstreamed into planning and into budgeting. Now, central to our government's understanding of the role and place of our transition to a low carbon economy and climate resilient society is the understanding that this transition will only succeed if it helps us not only to address climate risks, but helps us with our broader development challenges. And I think in that sense, we would very much want to be aligned with what Salim has explained is one of the major themes of the research. When government included green technology in the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, we understood that this sector can open up new sectors for energy generation, for mining, for manufacturing, and for agricultural production. But we were also clear at that time that these important new sectors have to help us with our broader objectives of reindustrialization, localization, economic inclusion, and most importantly, job creation. Now, the second understanding of climate transition for us is the concept of climate justice. And our understanding of justice is that workers and communities in sectors that will be most affected either by climate change itself or by the transition to a low carbon technology, these workers and communities cannot disproportionately carry the burden of the technological changes that are coming. And so as we work on this research on identifying transition pathways, we are centrally concerned that the transitional processes facing workers and communities must form part of our conceptualization. I think in this sense, we're very much at one with yourselves in saying that, of course, technological changes have happened throughout history. And usually those who are most vulnerable in society are the casualties of those technological changes. We're very keen to ensure that through active planning and active conceptualization, workers and communities in vulnerable sectors and industries must be an integral part of developing and benefiting from new industries and enterprises so that nobody is left behind in this transition. And in this regard, I think it's quite interesting to look at the point made in the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Perception Survey that says, and I quote, "The least disruptive climate transition measures will be those that holistically integrate the needs of individuals, societies, and businesses with the planet." And so we have said that our just transition towards a low carbon economy and climate resilient society must happen in a manner that does not impede the socio-economic development of our country as a whole. It must be socially just, and it must result in an increase in sustainable jobs. Now, if we are putting the issue of justice at the center of the transition, then we have to understand that there can't be a sudden shift in economic activity. But this has to occur over a period of time. It has to be conscious, it has to be researched, and it must be introduced in a properly phased manner. Equally important, it must be characterized by the active involvement of workers and communities who will be impacted on by the transition in defining both the objectives of the transition and the roadmap to get there. And it is, I think that really it's in this context that we need to understand the decision to set up the Climate Commission and to understand the work that the Climate Commission is doing. So the Presidential Climate Commission was set up at the beginning of last year. It's driven by the presidency, and its aim is to ensure a focused drive on the just transition, particularly identifying pathways for all sectors and buy-in from all stakeholders. Now, from a national government starting point, we are clear that we've got to begin this low carbon transition with our energy sector. Eskom, as we know, generates 88% of our energy from coal-fired power stations and is responsible for over 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So if we want to lower the carbon footprint of our goods and services, it makes sense to start with our energy sector. Because we understand that this sector poses a significant risk to future competitiveness, but we also understand that it offers new opportunities to promote new access to cheaper and more reliable sources of energy, and to take advantage of our natural resources, namely sun and wind. South Africa is amongst the 10 top sunniest countries in the world and actually does extremely well. I don't remember the exact ranking on wind, but we do extremely well on wind availability as well. And of course, we are ideally placed to take advantage of opportunities offered by international cooperation under the Paris Agreement. Now, the vulnerability of the coal sector emphasizes this importance of a just transition. This is where both our power utility and our country are now entering into new and very uncharted waters on just exactly how we are going to ensure workers and communities in the coal value chain are both active framers and beneficiaries of the climate transition. To support this process, Eskom has already completed socioeconomic studies at 3 power stations that are due for decommissioning, namely Komati, Grootvlei, and Hendrina. And together with Eskom, we have managed to secure funding for 7 more studies for stations that are due for decommissioning by 2030 or the early 2030s. These studies focus on the conditions in the plants themselves, on the workers who are working there, on their skills base, on the surrounding communities, and the relationship of those communities to the coal value chain, and of course, on the broader economic environment in the province of Mpumalanga as a whole. They have analyzed direct and indirect job losses and potential job losses and vulnerabilities. And they also analyze opportunities for repurposing, reskilling, and retraining, as well as the development of new local industries and new job creation. Early findings from the 3 studies that we have completed suggest that if we repurpose these 3 power stations, we can prevent all the direct job losses. And if we work properly, consciously, and deliberately on the economic ecosystem in those towns and deliberately develop new industries relating to components and renewables and battery storage, we can in fact not only prevent job losses in terms of indirect jobs, but we could actually have a net job gain. Now, what you can see from this approach is integral to Eskom's understanding, and I think it's the understanding of government as a whole, is that we can only learn by doing. Because as Salim said in his introduction, this is very new and very uncharted territory. And so Eskom took a decision that Komati Power Station would be the proof of concept project. And already they are repowering the power station with renewables on existing land. They're putting in what they call these agrivoltaic cells, so you can do agricultural cultivation underneath the actual solar panels. And in due course, there are engineering studies looking at the question of capacity for PV and battery storage that will be completed within the next 12 months to 2 years. To reach this point, Eskom actively worked with individual households, with organized labor, with business, with community organizations and formations, and with NGOs. So that the learning that we have is not just about the technology, but it's about what it actually means to involve those who are directly affected in planning for the transition and executing that transition. Now, obviously, this transition, as others have said, is going to cost a lot of money. And when we conceptualize the transition, Eskom, green hydrogen, the automotive sector, that is just the starting point. I think we are all agreed in this seminar that we are looking at a transition that ultimately is going to involve the whole of our economy. And so let me say a little bit by way of conclusion about the $8.5 billion that were offered to South Africa on the sidelines of COP26. And I think that in this regard, there are 4 points that are relevant. The first point is that given our current socioeconomic context and the current constraints on government and private sector balance sheets, we are going to need international support and international investment if we are going to be able to succeed with this transition. Secondly, in terms of the Paris Agreement, developed countries have an obligation based on the fact that they are the historical beneficiaries of high carbon emissions and consequently have been able to achieve their developed country status. They have an obligation to provide support to developing countries to transition to a low carbon future. The third point that we have to make here, and I think that this really relates to the issue of how do we as a country understand these kinds of agreements in relation to our national sovereignty and our right and ability to be determining the nature of the transition ourselves. And I think in this regard, in the political declaration that accompanied the offer, we had negotiated to make it clear that the pace and extent of decarbonization in South Africa will be determined by the financial support available and by the socioeconomic challenges facing our country. So we are not going to enter into financial agreements at any price and at any cost that undermine either our national sovereignty or our ability to negotiate the just transition as our workers and our communities and our country see fit. Fourthly, and perhaps most importantly, the declaration says that the funding offered will be used for targeted programs of reskilling, upskilling, employment creation, and other forms of support to ensure workers, women, and youth are the major beneficiaries of our shift to a greener future. Now, this is very important because obviously what we all understand is that many of the technological changes that will take place can be financed through private loans at commercial rates, because there will be many different private sector actors involved in this. But the question that we have to answer is, how are you going to finance the socio-economic objectives of the just transition? How are you going to finance the justice component? Because in a loan situation, you would require a revenue stream to pay back that loan. For some of the work that needs to be done to repurpose the power stations and to ensure that workers and communities in that situation benefit from the transition, that is not necessarily something that is going to be able to be financed out of a direct private sector loan agreement or profit-based financial agreement. And I think that this is why we think it's very important that part of what has to be unpacked here is the question of how much of this offer is grant financing, how much of it is concessional financing, what does concessional mean, how does this relate to Eskom's current state of indebtedness, and most importantly, how does it relate to the regulatory framework of our country? Because what we understand at the end of the day is that if there are loans on offer here, these obviously have to be done through the sovereign and have to be in line with all the prescripts that National Treasury would require. So this is why the president recently appointed Mr. Daniel Manele, whom everybody knows is a former Deputy Reserve Bank Governor, to support the work of the South African negotiating team so that we can fully understand exactly what is on offer here and how it fits in with our regulatory environment. We're expecting that the negotiations would be finalized over the next 6 months to 1 year. And obviously, once we understand all the issues, the final agreement would have to go back to our cabinet for approval. Now, Executive Director, the research study that you are launching today could not have come at a better time. As a country, we are at the point where we're going to have to take several important and far-reaching decisions to ensure that we maintain our economic competitiveness and we embark on this just transition. I think that the policy advice contained in this research document is going to help those of us who have to make those decisions ensure that we make the best possible decisions based on the best possible evidence that is available to us at this particular point in time. As you said, Joel, in your introduction, the path that lies ahead of us is filled with possibilities, but it is also filled with potential pitfalls and dangers. If we are to fully exploit those possibilities, and we are to ensure that we integrate the needs of individuals, of communities, of business, on a more sustainable road for our country and our planet, we are going to have to work together to build a common understanding amongst all sectors of our society, both of the need for this transition and for its just components. I really believe that your study is an important contribution in the building of this common understanding and this common consensus, without which we will not be able to move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Barbara. That was very, very insightful. And indeed, it is quite necessary that we understand the risks that are associated with embarking on this just transition, as you have mentioned. And also, we do need to be aware that we do have an obligation as South Africa to transition, since we signed the Paris Agreement. And so that binds us into realizing the low carbon and transitioning to a low carbon economy. And also quite important that as we embark on this journey as a country, we are learning by doing, as you have mentioned. And so we are planning and executing as we are moving along. And quite important that you've touched on the issue of finance, and that you have assured us that we will not enter into any financial deals blindly. And thank you so much for summarizing that very well. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of Minister Pravin Gordhan. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. Right now, we'll take a few questions for the minister from the audience that we received during her address. The first question that we will take is from Harold. Harold says that thank you for the clear statements on climate justice. The Presidential Climate Finance Task Team working on implementing offer of 8.5 billion to support our just energy transition. Will the task team include a just transition fund so that the concessional value of the loans can be spent on regional economic development and support the livelihoods? In other words, will social justice be hardwired into the financial engineering or just the main concept? That is the question we have. Over to you, Minister.
I think this issue of a just transition fund is a really interesting issue, and it's something that came up at the Climate Commission in our meeting on Friday. We haven't discussed it, but I think that really what is clear is that there isn't going to be one just transition. There are going to be many transitions over a very long period of time. And I think at the moment, we have been thinking about kicking it off. We've been thinking about the first 3 projects, the Eskom, the green hydrogen, the automotive sector. But I think many people are starting to raise this question, okay, so what happens in the longer term, and how will we ensure that in sectors which are not so significant as Eskom, that as you say, the just transition is kind of hardwired into the DNA of how we approach this. So it's new thinking, and it's definitely something that we can take back, and I think it'll probably go formally to the president from the commission, because we haven't really thought about the form. We're still at the point of saying, okay, we've got this offer. What's in there? What does it mean? What can we use it for? But I think these are interesting questions that are coming about the future.
That is great, Minister. And just to point it out, we do have one of our authors, Chantel Naidu. She will also touch on climate finance later on the program, where she addresses these sort of issues about what kind of finance and what just transition finance should look like. The second question that we have from the audience is from Darren. Please, could you comment on extending the first phase of South Africa's carbon tax by 3 years to December 31, 2025, and what effect this would have on the just transition to a low carbon future?
My understanding is that this is to allow us to put all the architecture in place, and also to resolve to allow the National Assembly to consider the climate bill. I think there've always been concerns raised around carbon budgets, carbon tax, all of these kind of transitional agreements. So I think that what this is doing is giving us a bit of space, so that we can sort out all the mechanisms and the modalities. in other jurisdictions, you don't necessarily have carbon budgets. The carbon budgets are required by the UNFCCC. The carbon tax is a domestic mechanism. It's not required by the UNFCCC. And part of what we've got to work out is how these two things will sit together and will work together. And I think that the extension of the current jurisdiction gives us a bit of space to do that. Because, you know, we're not exactly sure how long it's going to take for the climate bill to go through the National Assembly. I want it by the end of this year, but, you know, there's separation of powers. It's not in my hands anymore. So I think that we must allow a bit of space for the transitional arrangements.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that. And yeah, that's quite relevant, and because things take time, and we need to allow for the right processes and policies to take effect before we make before we make decisions. The final question that we'll take from the audience is from David. Sasol championed technology of fuel to coal, and at one stage supplied 50% of our fuel consumption. Today, we should be at about 80% self-sufficient in our fuel needs, with cheaper petrol than now. If coal is to be phased out, what is going to happen to make petrol affordable at all? That is the question from David. Were you able to get that, Minister?
Probably not the right person to ask.
Yes.
But I mean, I don't think there's a linkage between those two issues, other than that they're both fossil fuels. But my understanding from Minister Godongwana's budget speech yesterday is that Treasury, National Treasury and Minerals and Energy are having a conversation about the cost of fuel. And we would know that a part of the cost of fuel is the international exchange cost of fuel, and the other part would be tax levies that would the fuel levy. And my understanding is that there's a recognition by both Treasury and Minerals and Energy that petrol and diesel are an input into the entire economic value chain, and we know that every time the price of fuel goes up, it has a knock-on effect on the cost of food and on the cost of living generally. So my understanding is that there is a discussion going on between National Treasury and DMRE on this matter to try and look into the most appropriate way to bring about an affordable price of liquid fuel.
Thank you so much, Minister, for answering that. David, the Minister, has clarified that the right departments are working on the issue and they will attend to it. I would like to also acknowledge the presence of former Minister Rob Davies. Thank you for joining us today, sir. I think we'll end it here with the questions for the Minister. Thank you so much, Minister Barbara, for giving us insights and being with us today. And we will now move to the next session of this program.
Chairperson, I'm sorry to jut in and to delay your program. It's Joel here. Just to indicate that, as the Minister has said, the question with regard to Sasol is better handled by other departments and by Sasol itself. From the minimal knowledge that one has, and we can ask Sasol if it's present here or much later. From the minimal knowledge that one has is that using, I think it's called their Fischer-Tropsch technology, they will be in time transitioning from utilizing coal to utilizing green hydrogen. in order to undertake various industrial activities and possibly the production even of fuel. And they are part of the initiative that pertains to the Hydrogen Valley, working with Toyota and others, that in time, the fuel, even for transport, should be hydrogen. So yes, we'll continue with the current fuels going forward, but in time, we would transition to hydrogen. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Edie, for providing insights on that. On the next line of our program, we have a presentation from one of our authors, Gayla Montmason-Clare, is here to tell about the effect of the South Africa's vision of a just transition in public policy. Gayla is a senior economist at Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, known as TIPS. He leads TIPS' work on sustainable growth. Gayla is also a research associate at the University of Johannesburg Center for Competition, Regulation, and Economic Development. He holds 2 master's degrees from France and has more than 12 years extensive research in the transition and inclusive green economy from a developing country perspective, with a focus in policy framework, industrial development, just transition, and resource security. Prior to TIPS, Gayla worked at the French Ministry of Economy and Finance, as well as the United Nations Environment Programme. Over to you, Gayla.
Thank you so much, Program Director, and it's really a pleasure to be here today. Let me also take the opportunity to congratulate really the MISTRA team for the book. It's really exciting after months and months of hard work to be here to launch that book, and very pleased to have been able to contribute ever so slightly to this volume. So very pleased about it. Really, what I'm going to be talking about now builds very much on the comprehensive overview of the lay of the land by the minister, and zone in really on one concept, that concept of justice, and try to unpack that in terms of the meaning of that concept for South Africa. I'm presenting on behalf of my co-author as well, Najma Mohamed, who unfortunately could not join us from the Green Economy Coalition. Our starting point really is that, as it was highlighted by the previous speakers, we are at a crucial moment in time. It's really a moment to question both the purpose and the outcomes of our development pathways. It's really a moment to question both the end goals, but also the journey, to get those end goals. And that comes effectively from multiplicity of crises that, again, have been stressed and highlighted by the previous speakers. And we've already started to see, in line with those challenges, some changes. We have a plethora globally of so-called green policies, plans, and strategies. And of course, while we are here today, the agenda of a just transition has gained tremendous prominence. It is an old concept dating back from the 1970s, effectively, but it's really prominent now recently in the last few years. But despite this growth, effectively, in green and just thinking and policies, there are some concerns that the term of just transition is being stripped of its meaning and its transformational purpose. So what Najma and I set to do was to really kind of provide a bit of a normative framework around what we mean by a just transition, and try and assess whether those principles have already transpired when it comes to South Africa's policies, We looked at our industrial policy, we looked at employment policy, and then we looked at climate policy specifically. So let's delve into it right away. When we talk about just transition, we're really talking about stakeholders who are at risk, who are vulnerable. And here we can think about it in four particular ways. There is certainly what we call mono-economy towns, which are towns that are dependent on one activity. We often think of coal, but it doesn't limit itself to that. We also see it in rural towns that again can be very kind of linked to one particular activity, and that can be very vulnerable should that activity be phased out or transformed dramatically. Of course, as was mentioned as well, sectors that are decarbonizing sometimes rapidly are at risk because of the changing nature of their structure and the employment. And we need to look at those sectors as well. Even if the technologies are available to decarbonize, then these are some impacts, of course, from a social perspective. And then we need to consider the sectors or the areas that are impacted by climate change, more the physical impact that the minister was talking about here, things like agriculture, tourism, low-lying areas. So we have effectively kind of a whole of society approach that transpires from workers to communities to consumers and overall to citizens. It will be hard to find a stakeholder that is not impacted by the transition. The crux of the matter is that not everyone has the same ability to adjust to those changes, of course, and vulnerable stakeholders in that sense need to be supported. But what do we mean by just transition? This is often an open debate globally and in South Africa, but we've thought about it, thinking about three key dimensions of transitional justice. First dimension, which is very central in South Africa, is procedural justice. It's about the form. It's about the inclusive process. And that's really about the process itself. Is it inclusive? Is it supportive? The second dimension, which is what people tend to understand as just transition when they think about it at first, is distributive justice. It's about the impacts from the transition. Some people are going to lose their livelihood, lose their jobs. Some companies are going to close down. They should be supported. Those direct impacts should be addressed. That's about really the risks and the responsibilities. And then there's a third aspect, which is often a bit more controversial at a global level, but very much anchored in the South African context, which is restorative justice. And it's the opportunity really to use the just transition to rectify some historical wrongs, to try and ameliorate the situation of armed or disenfranchised communities, over time. So that's really here that lies the transformative aspect of the just transition. But when we think about just transition, it was said that there are many just transition. And I think it's really important to understand that as much as everyone talks about just transition, a lot of times people mean different things. There's a variety of ambition levels that can be pursued. We need to reckon with the fact that we have stakeholders that are trying to resist transition to some extent, and others who are in favor of the transition, but not paying too much attention to whether or not it's just. And I think we have to reckon with those particular currents, so that we can bring them on board, the just transition journey with us. And then within the mantra of just transition, there is different levels of ambition. And I think we also have to reckon with this. There is fairly low level of ambition, which we call managerial reform, which means that just dealing with the short-term impact without looking at the transformation of the system. Whereas we can go quite high in terms of the ambition of saying, well, let's use just transition to really transform the political, social, economic systems that have created the situation that we're in today. And I think, across the room, in the country, globally, we have this spectrum available. And I think that's important to understand that effectively, the just transition process is really transformative only in its most ambitious version, of course, but that in practice, any just transition would result from a mix of measures encompassing this variety of approaches, and it's going to be incremental. It's going to be building blocks. We're not going to go from where we are today to where we want to be tomorrow overnight. It's going to be a process, and again, that has been quite highlighted that we are through the journey of the transition and a journey of the just transition itself. If we take just a moment to unpack those three dimensions a little bit more, as I said, the first dimension that we think about is procedural justice. And here, it has a very key assumption. The assumption is that we cannot have a just outcome if we do not have a just process, an inclusive process. And it's not just about really being inclusive and open. It's really about empowering everyone to take part. And I think that's really fundamental in the thinking, in moving from simply having public participation to aiming for co-development, co-creation of that transition, acknowledging that, of course, this is difficult to achieve, but really important to think about some of the concepts that have been at the core of our procedural justice, things like giving voice to everyone, making sure that we have a trustworthy process that starts effectively before decisions are made, and continues once they have been made, so that we can allow monitoring and evaluation and course correction effectively. The second dimension mentioned is distributive justice, and here it comes down to the fact that, of course, the transition is disruptive. Like every transition, it brings risks, it brings opportunities, but it is disruptive. So it is critical that we foster new employment and decent work, that we drive investment and that support the emergence of new opportunities, and effectively also provide a genuine safety net to workers, but also citizens in general through this transition. Comes down to three key sets of policies. Our industrial development policies, our industrial policies, of course, which are critical in developing those new opportunities. We need an inclusive labor market through our labor market policies, and I'm sure LeBron would speak a lot more about that, around the employment conditions and really the workplace representativity as well, and many other aspects. And then the third dimension, which should not be forgotten, is social protection, right? And that widens the net effectively beyond just the people who are employed, and that's critical within the South African context, given, of course, our high level of unemployment, inequality, and poverty. But as I mentioned, there is a third dimension, which is retrospective justice, and here it's really again about the opportunity to right historical wrong, and it's a core pillar really to improve the resilience of stakeholders to climate shock, but I would say more broadly, the kind of economic and social resilience of vulnerable stakeholders. And here it speaks to issues around socioeconomic empowerment. It speaks to issues around socio-cultural restorations, particularly in non-predatory use of the land. And it speaks, of course, to environmental restorations, particularly when it comes to mining activities. If we take that framework, which can sometimes at this level be somewhat abstract, and we think about it in terms of as it transpired already to our policies. We briefly looked, as I mentioned, at industrial policy, employment policy, and climate policy. So very, very briefly, what we find from our industrial policy is that historically it has been quite a top-down process, but that since 2019 and the master plan approach, there is a more inclusive process to develop our industrial policy, which aims at co-creating kind of sector-specific plans, but they are mostly between industry, also government, industry, and trade unions. there's still a lack of involvement of civil society in that particular respect. We think about distributive justice, we find many green shoots when it comes to our transition to green industrial policy. That's the case, I would argue, of every tool in the box has been used. Every industrial policy tools in the box have been used to some extent to promote our green economy transition. But when we take a closer look, what we find is that it's only a small fraction of our industrial policy that supports the green industrial development. And I think the bulk of our policy still promotes an economic development that, at times counteracts the transition. And I think we need to reckon with that and increase the shift that we are into. When it comes to restorative justice, again, industrial policy, I think, has been critical to address some of the inequalities in the country. But it is also part of the problem around having that long-standing promotion of an extractive and polluting industrial development, and that shift that has started must be accelerated effectively. If we look at our employment policy, what we find is that there's existing capacity and dialogue structures around labor market implications. We've got some great work being done around green jobs assessment, green skills assessment, employment vulnerability studies. But the social dialogue has been really focused at national level, and I think we need that to come down at a more granular level, really at the industry level, at the community level, at the city level, to get a better understanding, and importantly, to have that grassroots, bottom-up enaction of the just transition. Looking at distributive justice, we find that through our employment policies, particularly through our public employment programs, we've made some inroads, and certainly, programs like EPWP have contributed to South Africa's green employment ambition. But the question is, we need both green and decent jobs, and we know the challenges around that aspect of decent jobs and decent employment through some of the public employment programs. So I think there is, again, here an opportunity to extend this much further and do better. When it comes to restorative justice, it is again a question about, can we have green and decent employment and employment that is accessible to all? And again, we have, I think, a basis to build upon, but can do a lot better to use our employment policy to ensure greater employment overall, rather than plugging holes where we can. Last but not least, we looked at our climate policy, and here we find that, again, from a procedural perspective, climate policy has been developed through a relatively inclusive process in the country, but again, fairly national level driven. Although there has been ongoing social dialogue, such as the one driven by the NPC, for instance, historically, and it is largely complemented by a wide array of civil society processes, that have really been active on the ground. But there seems to be a lack of connection between the two, and I think we can really do more to connect the processes at the national level and at the local level, because they're both very vibrant, but often don't talk to each other. When it comes to distributive justice, there were vulnerability assessments that were conducted, as well as resilience plans that were developed for the Department of, at the time, Environmental Affairs and the Economic Development Department, that really looked at the climate impact on 5 key value chains in the sectors. And I think they really provided a great springboard for action. But the question is, can we take them further? Can we implement them going forward effectively? When it comes to restorative justice, it's again a question about reparations to stranded workers and communities. And can we factor this into our climate pathways? And I think, Minister has really stressed that, in terms of having those employment-rich, equitable, inclusive, low-carbon pathways going forward. These are not just low-carbon pathways. They have a bigger ambition, and they need to be thought as such. And here, of course, in Mpumalanga, and the coal value chain in the country is very much a test bed. I think at a country level, but by many respects at a global level. You know, I often tell colleagues, you know, Mpumalanga is probably the most famous province in the climate world at this point in time, and you know, and we need to harness that opportunity. So in a nutshell, you know, does South Africa make the grade in its ambition for just transition? I'd say, you know, it's a pass, but with a narrow margin. Why is that? Because we have great ambition in some respect. You know, we have the vision there. We are much further along than most countries when it comes to talking about just transition and thinking about just transition. We have a great vision. And it is quite broad-based, but it still lacks ambition in its implementation. Often, you know, we are sitting more between a reform agenda rather than a transformative agenda. And I think we can do more when it comes to, you know, to recognizing procedural justice. We can do more when it comes to using the opportunity of a just transition to restore historical wrong. But we have the right intent, and we have fundamental building blocks that we can use going forward. In closing, what we can say is that, of course, changing the trajectory of the economic system is a massive task. You know, we're not really dealing with an easy task ahead of us, and you know, we need to, I guess, have our ambition to be commensurate with that challenge. You know? And I think we can do that by harnessing the building blocks that we already have today. If we deepen our understanding and then we deepen our action, I often say that we know what needs to be done in many respects. We have the tools to do that. I guess it's do we dare do it? Can we shift gears to be more transformative and really kind of give meaning to the mantra of leaving no one behind? So in summary, of course, the time to act is now, and it is to design and implement pathways that build societies and economies that are more just, equal, and inclusive, that are better integrated with nature, that offer social protection for all, and that are more informed by science. I thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Gayla, for that wonderful presentation. The chapter or the working paper that Gayla has just presented is available on MISTRA's website. It's quite informative, everyone, as you have heard. Najma and Gayla have done brilliant work in developing this framework to assess whether the current policies that we have in South Africa are ambitious enough to, to deliver transformative just transition outcomes. On the next part of the program, we have Kenneth Creamer, who will be giving us a presentation on shaping a new economic model growth for South Africa, the role of a well-managed energy transition. Kenneth Creamer is an academic economist based at the University of Witwatersrand. Creamer has a master's degree in law and financial economics and a PhD, for which he was awarded the gold medal by the Economic Society of South Africa as the South Africa's best PhD in economics, submitted in 2010. We are honored to have Dr. Creamer here with us today. Over to you, Kenneth.
Thank you very much, Mobile. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'd like to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay.
Please
thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you to MISTRA for having commissioned this book and for having invited me and others to think about these matters. Yeah, it's a very august panel and an even more august and longer list of participants who know a lot about this subject. My contribution is really as an economist, seeing the economic importance of this energy transition for South Africa and the world. In a sense, in the long run, this is a matter of life and death for the human species, I suppose, and for the planet. But in the medium run, it's really about our livelihoods and whether we are going to become poorer and more unequal as a society, or whether we can use this transition to try and improve people's livelihoods. So the current context in South Africa is that load shedding, as we know, is costing the economy a great deal, or billions of rands per year. There are various estimates. The indirect cost of load shedding is almost difficult to comprehend, in the form of lost investment, lost jobs, employment that will never happen. And I would argue that it's due to this electricity shortage that South Africa, it's one of the key reasons. There's been corruption and state capture, but the energy shortage is one of the key reasons that we've been trapped into a low growth path for the past decade and more. And that's why this energy transition is not just about changing our electricity, but giving us access to reliable, low cost and sufficient electricity again as quickly as possible to try to begin growing again as an economy. So a key objective of this transition, as far as I'm concerned, is the restoration of that reliable electricity source, and then also to look at taking advantage of the new technology and the potential backward and forward linkages that will either be enhanced through this technological change, or which will be neglected. A failed energy transition, I would argue, will result in ongoing electricity shortages, deepening poverty and inequality. Scarce electricity will be available mainly to the well-off, and the economy will continue to shrink and decay. So it's a bit of a tipping point, if you put it that way. Are we going to be able to manage this transition to get out of this low growth path, or are we going to go deeper into it and see inequality rising in our society? The four major interventions that we are undertaking as a society, there are others, but the major ones for energy security would be obviously the IRP process, where it seeks to invest over 30,000 megawatts of new capacity over the next 10 years. And wind and solar power, for economic reasons, are very important in that process. And I'll show you a slide on that, not only from a policy and decarbonization perspective, but also from a pure economic perspective. Then there's been other reforms, for example, trying to ease up the licensing requirements for firms to invest in capacity, which has been supported broadly by labor, business, government, because it is such a critical problem for jobs in the society. If factories, mines, shopping centers, farms don't have electricity, and this reform is an important one. And it's also in line with the decentralization of our power as we move away from the natural monopoly type, vertically integrated monopolies that have existed before, to a more decentralized system, which is inherent to the technology, the technological change. There's also a government emergency procurement program, which to some extent seems to be progressing in parts, but parts of it there's been issues raised around the costs and the design of this program, and there's been delays. And then the last is the actual restructuring of Eskom, which is integral to this. For the society to have inclusive growth, and for the energy transition to be one that is inclusive and effective to reach all corners of the country, our national grid is key to that, and having a nationally managed grid. And therefore, Eskom needs to reorganize itself into those three entities, generation, transmission, distribution. And it's really about reorganizing the public ownership of that electricity system to ensure that we're able to have a national system rather than one which is fragmented. And part of that problem is this crippling debt. You know, the crippling debt of Eskom is due to a range of factors, whether it's corruption, whether it's the problems with the Medupi Kusile project design, the costs involved, but also the mispricing it with over to court over debt, and the need to try and find a resolution in that is critical. Some of the economic is just to look at these costs. Now, this is a document that Eskom produced last year. Wind and solar have really come to the fore, along with gas as a transitional input, is if you look at the cost of energy for solar, 4.1 cents, wind 5.4 cents, gas 7.3 cents, nuclear 19.8 cents, new coal 15.9 cents, and how long it takes to bring this on stream, 18 months to 24 months, 24 to 36 months, 24 to 60 months, 12 to 15 years, 10 to 12 years. So in the context of an energy constrained economy, which is causing low growth and lack of investment, lack of confidence, we have a strong kind of incentive to move with the lowest cost and the shortest lead times, and the IRP reflects that. There's also the energy transition gives us the possibility, and I think Joel Netshitenzhe also hinted at this, that we could be building new industries. So the apartheid economy was based on the dispossession and the super exploitation of the African majority, together with the exploitation of the minerals and energy complex. And that saw that unequal growth that we all grew up with and we all know about and we can still see. Now, what is the new growth model? And the energy transition and how we manage it is key to that new growth model. I think Joel Netshitenzhe mentioned something about a new green minerals and energy complex. It's something fundamental like that we need to be thinking about when I know it's already a complex process, as Gaylor and others have shown us, but in terms of the economic growth aspects of this energy transition is fundamental. The upstream parts, are we going to build wind towers, solar panels? What jobs can be created rather than just importing these components? Downstream, can we use wind and solar power base to develop green hydrogen for local use and for export, green steel, electric vehicles? But we must do this in a smart way. You know, there's been all of these contestations around localization, which some of it is uncalled for, but it must be a smart design, because if we start to specify local content on wind towers or solar panels that are not produced locally, which has been one of the issues in the recent period, where we actually did have some of that capacity, and when there was political contestation around the IRP and Eskom refused to keep on buying wind and solar for some time, those plants closed down. So we have a 10 to 20 year planning horizon, and we must design cleverly to get those upstream and downstream. Badly designed or ill-informed designs are going to be counterproductive and are going to slow the energy transition. So that is an important caveat. As others have said, much of our energy transition has ground zero. In Mpumalanga, if you look at this map here, the coal-fired heart of South Africa is in Mpumalanga. And there's some in other provinces as well, but it's really the heart of it here. So if you started tabula rasa and you said the whole country will run on wind and solar with some transitional input from gas, you would build in the Northern Cape your solar. It's amongst the best in the world, the quality of the solar, and there's wind in the Western and Eastern Cape. But because of the path dependency, as economists call it, on coal, the grid itself is actually not there. And to rebuild an entire grid in these other provinces is going to be obviously very, very expensive. So Mpumalanga's got this benefit of having grid, and we can see that Eskom is already announcing plans, and that's why it's such a key to the success of this energy transition. I know in the popular imagination it's Eskom and it's not delivering and it's got load shedding to blame, but we need to restructure Eskom to make it succeed. They're releasing land in Mpumalanga for these wind and solar, repurposing these coal-powered plants, as the Minister, Barbara Creecy, was talking about, and even building industrial hubs, smart grids, etc., in that area. So Mpumalanga's got a serious advantage here in that the grid is already in place. And even if it might not be the best wind and the best solar, there is a lot to be done. And because the people, as we say, it's people-centered, are also in Mpumalanga, who are involved in the sector, it does provide a sweet spot for us to say, well, we're going to repurpose, we're going to find people moving into wind and solar technologies as well. The coal mining companies are integrally linked in this area. I mean, I was speaking to somebody from one of the coal majors, and they're saying, well, do you know, we supply water to eMalahleni without really charging them for it because we have to get it out of the mine. It just made me realize this is deeply, deeply integrated into this province, you know, and the province needs to, with national help, plan the energy transition, the water transition, all sorts of things are related there. And then, as others have spoken about in detail, the financing for this is available to some extent, is potentially available. And we need to make sure that South Africa, in this very difficult international environment that we are going through at the moment, is able to navigate how we use that potential offer in a way that is sustainable, in a way that the country understands that this is actually in our interests and it's in the world's interests, and there's an alignment here rather than something being imposed on us. We need to say it's about jobs, it's about growth, etc., the just transition. I'm conscious of time, so I won't. You can read the chapter and you can access the chapter. Just some theoretical issues here that using basic economic models to show what happens with a technology transition. We want South Africa to move from point A to point D, basically, where you have technology leads to increased employment and higher wages. But if we mishandle it, we'll go from A to B. If we don't have the conducive institutions to have the just transition, to adopt the technologies, to license the technologies, to give them the go-ahead, to finance those technologies, you move from A to B, where you lose employment, you don't invest in new technology, you become uncompetitive, and wages ultimately will actually fall down to this wage curve here. So you'll have lower wages and lower employment, and that's the scenario, the disaster scenario, where this energy transition leaves us in a situation we have more poverty and more inequality rather than the D, you know. So you can look at some of those issues. It's just classic technology and how does an economy deal with technological change. So the outcome is contingent, unfortunately. There's no certainty in this. It's our legal and public policy frameworks and the practices of trade unions, employee organizations, the positions they take, how their leadership views this, that is going to be quite key to determining our outcomes. Government, business, labor, it kind of harks of a social compact somewhere, a social compact around this just transition in Mpumalanga, for example, would be something quite concrete to get our teeth into. The risks to incumbent workers and effective communities will be reduced. There'll be less risk if public resources are mobilized to reskill workers, public utilities are able to repurpose and provide new employment, and if the policy frameworks operate efficiently. You know, all the noise that we have in the policy space about the contestation, we need to move beyond that so that we have a one message, many voices saying this is the way South Africa is moving forward. The contestation is not helpful. And means that our policy frameworks don't operate efficiently. There's been delays. As I said, there was like a long hiatus in the IRP because of contestation around what technologies are we going to use. That we cannot afford to get into that again. And we cannot afford for the kind of the car power ships and the court cases and the corruption to become entrenched in any way in for example, the IRP process, because if it becomes something that is delayed because of smells of corruption, it is going to really delay the energy transition. It needs to stay arm's length and operate without corruption free. So if these contingencies do not occur, then there's a real risk that the losers will outnumber the winners. And then finally, the key word from this input is we need to be forward looking, not backward looking in our policy design. I think most of the audience here is very familiar with this, so I don't need to go into it, but that forward-lookingness will be really made easier if there's new jobs, new firms are being created and opening up because of an intelligent and smart linkage to the upstream and downstream potentialities of the energy transition. Ngobile, thank you very much. That's the end of my input. I'll try and stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Creamer, for that insightful presentation. Indeed, South Africa's backbone of the economy is built on coal. And so with this transition offers us an opportunity to restructure and to develop a new economic model that will accommodate the new energy regime. On our next item, we will get to hear from Lebohang Molaisi about her chapter that is based on democracy in the just transition. Lebohang Molaisi is a labor market policy coordinator for the Congress of South African Trade Union. Her responsibilities and duties include the coordination and implementation of COSATU, labor market policy, and the just transition to a low-carbon economy. Lebohang has a strong interdisciplinary background in economics, development economics, labor economics, and labor law. She has a master's degree in development economics and a postgraduate diploma in labor law. Lebohang is also an EXCO and MANCO member of the National Economic Development and the Labor Council, NEDLAC, and represents labor in the Labor Market Chamber of NEDLAC. She is also a commissioner on the Presidential Climate Change Commission. Over to you, Lebo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mobile, and thank you very much for bringing in the trade union element into this very important book that is coming at a very opportune moment in our economy, in our society. I must give a lot of gratitude to my co-author, Professor Jacqueline Koch. Your inputs into this chapter, I think, have shaped it into what it has become. I think the work of the other authors as well have really made this a real good body of work that's going to empower anybody who's going to read it in terms of the future of South Africa if we follow this pathway to a just transition. So the previous speakers and the other authors, I think, Gaylo, you've done a fantastic job to talk about, the various elements and the framework of a just transition. And then, Dr. Kenneth Creamer coming in on the granularities and the economic restructuring and what's necessary in order to usher in a just transition. And I come in to talk about a part that I enjoy quite honestly, democracy and what that looks like in the context of a just transition. I think the various speakers have already talked about this. The points of contention and the various differences amongst various stakeholders around what the just transition is all about. But at its core is around this element of democracy. And I'll take you through what we meant by this and what the chapter seeks to drive as a key message around this important element of democratizing a just transition. To a large extent, the conversations of a just transition, like has been mentioned previously, it's not a new concept. It's been around for years, and I think in the South African context, it seems to be gridlocked at a national level. So what we try to talk about and what we try to explain and analyze in our chapter is around this concept of building a groundswell of activism amongst ordinary citizens who should own this concept, because at its core, it takes people into its centrality. So that's our element into this discussion around how to bring about that groundswell of activism, how to make this a concept that in the flurry and in the avalanche of other voices, the common person in the street can embody the core elements of a just transition, and how we can seek to impact on various social movements to bring about this democracy in the just transition. So what we've sought to do is to contribute to this element of democratizing the concept of a just transition. And by just transition, we mean deep transformative change that is going to benefit the majority of our people. To a large extent, this has already been talked about by the various speakers that have spoken before me. Our chapter demonstrates how, in the last 10 years, the concept of a just transition as a revolutionary idea containing the possibility of radical change to redistribute power and resources to create a more just and equal society has been appropriated over the years. Powerful social forces have stripped much of the transformative content. We describe how these social forces, particularly the coal mining corporations, form a set of constraints on achieving the imperatives and the developmental agenda of a just transition. At the same time, though, we acknowledge that new social forces are beginning to emerge from civil society to address the climate crisis and promoting the concept of climate justice, and this is important. In this chapter, we seek to suggest that, the various policy frameworks developed by organized labor, but particularly COSATU's policy framework from 2012, provides the basis on which the labor movement could mobilize different forms of power to address unemployment, poverty, and inequality, as well as climate change. It provides the basis for a democratic, eco-socialist alternative future. We emphasize that the process of democratization is necessary because with the present avalanche of voices addressing a just transition, the most affected, which are the coal workers, the people living in mining affected communities, and others, are seldomly heard. We conclude in our chapter that a just transition must be driven from below with an alliance that is led by various social movements which incorporate the voice of labor organizations. When the concept of a just transition was introduced to South Africa by various labor movements, it was grounded in people's lived experience and it was aspirational in nature. It was at the heart of a powerful narrative of hope and for a better life for all. In our chapter, we suggest that labor's present commitment to measures such as job protection, environmentally friendly investment, comprehensive social security for displaced workers, and skills development provide a basis for cooperation between labor and the various other new organizational initiatives around climate justice emerging in various quarters of civil society. We talk about the importance of alliances, and we talk about the importance of collaboration between various bodies of social movements. We like to call this the red and green collaboration, but because we notice that it is between these alliances and alliance building that we begin the process of democratizing a just transition. Now, while we accept in our chapter that initiatives in civil society are sometimes fragmented, and then the concept of a just transition, which has been indicated earlier, is very much contested, there are grounds for convergence of interests, especially between labor and environmental justice activists. However, this convergence, we acknowledge, is not straightforward. It's not been straightforward anywhere in the world. However, elements in the environmental movement, we acknowledge, sometimes have reduced the concept of a just transition to mean a shift to a new energy regime. For some, this could even take the form of privatized renewable energy, which is not labor intensive and is likely to mean higher energy prices that are not in the working class's interests. The labor movement is not against renewables, but increasingly defensive and adamant that the state's privatized renewable energy policy is a threat because it will involve job losses and increase energy prices. After all, private interests prioritize profit maximization, and the needs for social needs are often not met. Labor, in its articulation, and this is largely attributed to unions such as NUMSA, have called for publicly owned and democratically controlled renewable energy, largely made up of state-owned entities and community cooperatives. The environmental movement is increasingly adamant about the immediate closure of coal mines and coal-fired power stations. A shift to renewable energy is essential to a just transition, but does not always acknowledge the deep, just transition required to change the sources of energy and who owns and controls those various energy systems. Recently, tensions and animosities have resurfaced amongst these alliance members because of these issues of contentions, which we think, if the alliance were to work more collaboratively moving forward, these issues could be addressed for there to be better alliance building and better democracy around this issue of the just transition. We do believe, however, that labor's conceptual framing of a just transition can provide a basis for a mass coalition for broader social movements. The issues unions have been fighting for and building are the same issues that will strengthen us to deal with climate change and to usher in a just transition. By these issues, we mean full employment, issues relating to full employment, decent jobs and livelihoods, gender equality, clean water for all, food security, affordable access to healthcare, better education, decent housing in well-planned settlements with good affordable transport, people uniting to help each other, environmental sustainability, and an economy that puts people first ahead of profits. We believe that within this labor framing, conceptual framing of a just transition, in that we build the appropriate basis for coalition building and consensus among various stakeholders to bring about social movements that can usher in a just transition. The notion of a just transition could unite labor and environmental activists in struggle for survival in the form of eco-socialism. Eco-socialism is a viable alternative if it demonstrates concrete examples of cooperative work and communal ownership of productive resources. At the core of a democratic eco-socialism is the link between the principles of sustainability and justice. To illustrate, in terms of ecological sustainability, the critical question is not limited to the protection of natural resources, but rather that those resources are used to benefit all. And at the core of democracy within the just transition is this element of having a transition and a just transition that seeks to benefit all. You know, sometimes the conversations around the just transition seem to talk as though we're just merely shifting from one energy source to another. And that's problematic in its nature. The previous speakers have already talked about how this needs to usher in a transformative change and how we need to see redistribution in action through a just transition. New social forms involving reciprocity, solidarity, and cooperation emerge around these ideas, and they embody fragments of a vision of an alternative future. It also implies a new narrative of relations with nature, grounded in the acknowledgement that humans exist as part of an ecological community. It involves new social relations with people, which bolster trust, cooperation, and reciprocity. An alliance between labor and the progressive elements in civil society could generate social solidarity to achieve this future. And by doing this, we empower the ordinary man in the street in order to be able to embody the true meaning of a just transition. Like what I mentioned earlier, that, you know, because these concepts around energy, around renewable energy, energy mixes, just transition, planning, pathways, because they're so technical in nature, we often lose the ordinary man on the street. Those things become a deterrent when we want to build, you know, massive and social movements around this notion of a just transition. In order for us to achieve the buy-in and for us to achieve democracy in its earnest, we need to make sure that, you know, information is consumed in a way that is easier than what is currently the case. The fact that, you know, the discussions on a just transition are centralized at a national level, and there's no process to make all of that information cascade down to the groundswell, you know, of our movements, is problematic in its nature, because, you know, we run the risk of not including those people who are meant to be benefited by a process of a just transition, as we listen to whoever is shouting the loudest in the room when we talk about the issues of a just transition. So those become very important, especially if we are to build a groundswell of activism around a just transition and climate justice. These become very important because we need to get to the ordinary man on the street. We need to build a groundswell and develop in earnest a bottom-up approach. We use the term loosely, bottom-up approach, but what we really need to do is to build this form of activism and groundswell from the bottom so that we can get this bottom-up approach that will bring everybody along with us. We can't be said to be bringing along everyone with us if we are not all included at the table. And that is how we bring about democracy in the just transition. That's how we bring about a social movement and activism around this term, the just transition, because at its heart, it's about democracy, and it's meant to benefit those who have been on the outsides and on the periphery of economic inclusion, participation, and activity. So that is by means of our chapter, myself and Professor Jacqueline Koch on our chapter on democratizing a just transition. Thank you, Dr. Ngumbi.
Thank you very much, Lebogang, for that informative and insights contained in your chapter. And indeed, social justice as well as climate change are intersectional issues. And so alliances between labor and climate activists to forge new type of arrangements will be very critical in the just transition to ensure a fair and inclusive low carbon economy for South Africa. And our next speaker is Chantal Naidoo, who will be giving us some information about financing the just transition. Chantal Naidoo is the founder of Rabia Transitions Initiative, which consolidates a 25-year plus career in various finance contexts, including tax, debt capital markets, corporate finance, development, and climate finance. Chantal works at a nexus of transitions, finance, and sustainability transitions, advising policymakers, financial actors, and civil society in the transition process. She served as a regional advisor of the Green Climate Fund, supporting African government for 6 years to access climate finance, and co-designed South Africa's Green Fund. Over to you, Chantal.
Thank you, Nobile. And first of all, thank you to Mistra for this wonderful opportunity to contribute to this book. This morning was really heartwarming in so many ways to listen to the passion of the authors, of the minister, and Mr. Joel as well. Everyone who's just bringing their energy to this space. I think there's no shortage of conversation and thought going into how can we enable a just transition in South Africa. So I'll share with you, I know we are a little pressed for time, so I'll try and compress so that there's time for conversation. I'll share with you the journey of developing the chapter on financing a just transition. When Mistra extended the invitation to contribute, it was in the context of a very live and active space around the just transition, financing the just transition, with many ideas on the table already. So the brief was really to develop a chapter that would take us through a journey of climate finance, and whether this is really an option for helping to support South Africa's just transition aspirations. So just to give you a broad overview of the chapter, it reflects on the phenomena of climate finance as it was first constructed in the UN processes, and then how it's been offered by multilateral development agencies, specialist climate funds, and bilateral agencies, and that role that it could possibly play in our aspiration. And I will take you through a few highlights of the chapter and then speak to the current moment in South Africa where we are. So, by way of background, the sustainable finance movement is probably older than the climate finance movement, coming from the days of the sustainable development. So, and that all started in 1988, where there was many aspirations around bringing sustainability into the financial sector, and it manifested in certain incentives, in practices, lots of principles, to try and bring in a consciousness around environmental, social, and governance factors. And in the earliest days, what was fascinating for me is there was already a distinction being made between the quantity and the quality of finance that actually flows to developing countries. And the references to quality in the very earliest days, this is in the 80s, spoke to providing finance to support a transition to sustainability, which relates to forms of financial innovation, looking at lending rates, integrating trade and economic and finance sectors, and ensuring that all development interventions have a sustainable development features. So why is history important? I like it because it reminds me that it's not new that we're speaking about. There are conversations around finance, development, financing climate, now financing the transition, that have actually always been there. There have been scaffoldings that have been put around the financial system, and our conversations with international agencies as well, that have all had the same theme and fabric. The climate finance movement itself has evolved mainly under the UN system. We're familiar with the Green Climate Fund. South Africa has accessed that already. There's the Global Environment Facility. There's climate investment funds, which we've also accessed. And these funds have evolved, and their architecture and access has evolved in ways that many developing countries are not comfortable with, mostly because it's not fit for purpose in the current moment. And the reactionary nature of them in some ways, where the deals are coming to them rather than anticipatory nature, is one of the criticisms that I've picked up through the research. But in the last 2 or 3 years, there have been some very specific signals that highlight that these structures of access don't fully address our needs as a developing country to transition. And it highlights the mix, the minister mentioned the mix of terms of funding that unfolds. So there were 3 key ones that stood out for me. The dimension of the unfunded provisions for loss and damage around climate, the short and immediate term needs, and then the financing of the just and equitable transition, and then the impact of COVID-19, and what that revealed was the fragility of global systems just generally, and how ill-prepared we are for societal shocks. Since 2015, the financing conversation and debates around and following the Paris Agreement have been prolific. I can reference you to the biannual assessment that was published last year, where it describes in quite grand detail all the different initiatives that are happening at the level of different financial actors. And it's quite a veritable list. And it is clear that there's an awareness and a consciousness, but we're not yet clear of that impact. In the context of South Africa, we have some very positive signals as well, much of what the minister mentioned, but maybe also just to acknowledge the work of the National Treasury. They work specifically on sustainable finance frameworks, the disclosure guidances that they and the JSE are looking at. And Minister Creasy mentioned the differentiation in physical and transition risks. And I do support that, but in many ways, it needs to go further, in the sense that a new category to capture the just transition aspect is also necessary to be elevated, which is the social risks that we are dealing with. And through the social aspect, that's how we build resilience. On the chapter also looks at, goes back to the just transition academic and definitional debates, because that's been one of the bugbears of the whole climate finance system, that there's a lot of things that are stuck because we don't know what the definition, what does it mean? What does it mean to whom? Who is defining it? So in the context of just transition financing, there is clear language in the UNFCCC processes, even in the Paris Agreement, that makes recognition that climate finance has to support justice, equity, and inclusivity. It's not necessarily something that's separate. It's not something that's only for mitigation and adaptation has to be somewhere else. It's very much encompassing. I make this statement because I think that in many ways, the definitional issues can catch us. I think it will be more important for us as a country to figure out what does it mean for us? How will we use finance to support our journey? Because climate finance was always intended to meet the evolving financing needs of developing countries. And the transition effects end up being one of those. And the Paris Agreement actually proposes a very inconvenient truth, in the sense that underpinning it is about disruption, and there's simultaneous creation. We need to create a new path, and we need to find ways to responsibly exit pathways and development pathways that have been harmful to the environment. So moving to what would justice look like in South Africa's financing journey. And so some perspectives on this that the chapter throws out is the just dimensions of financing to a large extent might be narrowly defined. And Joel mentioned that in the beginning, that the chapter speaks to broadening the scope of not building off or trying to prove off a base that's already unjust. And I draw inspiration from 2 different places, and it's not in the chapter, but it's work that's happened since. there was a series of photographs by Dale and Paul, which just shows that abject poverty in mining communities where they have got jobs, but these jobs they've had for 20, 50 years and they're still living in mud huts. So would justice be good about replacing the job? And is justice enough to just replace the job and reskill? Or is justice about regenerating a livelihood and making the interventions that we put in place in those communities, make those communities thrive? And this, the inspiration for that comes from the work of Prashani Satyapal at Sustainability Truthing, who's been working also with tips around building an entire portfolio of projects that look at enabling communities to thrive and have dignified, prosperous livelihoods. So financing the just transition and the justice component is not only job replacement, but it's actually going back and looking at the quality of livelihood and trying to regenerate and give dignity back where unfortunately it hasn't existed. Perhaps I move to the issue of where we are in the present moment. Since the chapter was written, it was written just before, finalized just before the COP and the announcement of the 8.5 billion facility that's been offered to South Africa. So the ministers made 4 important points toward the end. She said we need the money. She said the developed countries are obliged under the convention to offer this money to South Africa. Thirdly, she said that we have a right to determine ourselves, our path and our pace of decarbonization. And fourth, she described the targeted use of proceeds and programs to support workers, women and youth. And those are really valuable directions that she's offered. So perhaps I just give some insights around the negotiations of that and what justice might look like on both sides. So, if you think of a sources and uses table, at the minute, we're having a lot of conversation in South Africa on the use side. How are we going to create justice in the interventions that we are engaging on? And that is obviously a very noisy space, and there's a lot of wonderful minds in our country that could come together. I think Dr. Creamer mentioned some of that, in that it's pointless looking back, looking forward. How do we bring our energies and our different views and create something really special in terms of constructing an investment portfolio in the next five years plus that actually encompasses these in a actual implementation context, as opposed to, I think it was Harold Winkler in the chat who said it's just going to be a concept. So, and there are ways to do it, but it means we also need to ask some very hard questions around what does justice look like in negotiating the terms and conditions, and what would it look like in a term sheet? And it does speak to the aspects of the mix of funding that comes to the country relative to where the funding might be needed, relative to who is going to access that money and making it available to the most vulnerable as well. Our own fiscal realities and the absorption of funding in SA and our ability to have our control and creativity in how we use that. I think importantly, and I also saw this covered in the chat a little bit, there needs to be justice in the visibility and access and use of those funds. So in my experiences in SA and also across the region, the funding comes in by international climate finance, and it sits in either in entities where they're not necessarily obliged to always disclose the depth of how has it been used, how is the benefits that have come in being passed on to either the projects or the programs. And from a justice perspective, so that we appreciate how funds are being utilized, these are really important, especially if we're talking about concessional funding and grant funding. We do need that visibility of the use of those funds. The onus to fund South Africa's just transition isn't only on international climate finance. We have a very sophisticated financial sector in South Africa. So what does the domestic responsibility look like? And how do we place people and benefits at the center of that? We have experience in our financial sector of doing so. We went through a political transition, and the financial sector was asked to contribute to that through the BEE financing and the processes that happened on that level. And again, when we attempted the renewable energy program, there's Some argue it isn't an energy transition program, but it certainly was a new sector. I won't comment on that, but there is evidence that we have of how we have taken a social objective in a financial construct and tried to achieve that social aspect. There's some good lessons, some bad lessons, and some really ugly lessons to learn from that as well. And from what I've drawn on, from what I've seen, is that it can't be left to imagination what the quality of South Africa's transition is and what we need, what the quality of what we need financed. And because it's not just a tick box to say, broad-based economic community, A this, A that. Government would need to give some direction on that quality, some direction on location, some direction on the impacts and the effects, and over what period we need that to happen. So because for some, in the context of a just transition, it's already too late. They are already struggling. And that's really important. I spoke to, earlier I mentioned there were 3 ideas that were touted towards the end of last year around what could be the components of South Africa's just transition angle. And perhaps the main message there is, while it's really exciting that we have an offer of $8.5 billion to help us in our just transition journey, it's by no means all we need. And it's by no means only for the energy sector. There's a whole lot more work we need to do to invest in ourselves. And from the international community, we also need an immense amount from them as well, to make sure we've got a balanced transition. We are investing in adaptation and building resilience, as well as we are addressing our decarbonization issues as well. So just to remind you, the 3 ideas was the idea of a just transition transaction, which was largely, and that's where the ideas of a just transition fund came about. Eskom put forward an idea about a sustainability-linked loan facility, and it didn't get taken up too much, but there was an idea of a debt for climate swap initiatives as well. What was fascinating for me looking at these, I think also earlier from Labour, there were ideas as well about Eskom and the equity on Eskom. What was just fascinating for me as a researcher looking at this is the rich intellectual capital we have in South Africa that could come together, and recognizing these ideas are not mutually exclusive. They could be complementary, part of a much longer term package, what we all need. So just to close off on my side, I think as we move into the next few months, running up to the COP27, which will be in Egypt, there's a lot of issues on the table for Africa to land. And I think, as Salim mentioned up front, many eyes are on South Africa on this particular facility to make sure that it is groundbreaking, path-breaking. Well, what does that mean in terms of how we negotiate it and how we use it? I think there are a few important questions we need to ask ourselves within, and that will then decide the shape on it. What demands are being made of the South African government in exchange for the funding? What risk is such funding absorbing beyond the capacity of our national institutions? And urgency of these funds. How soon can such funds be deployed in support of the NDC timeframes? We don't have a good track record of fast turnaround time from the climate funds. Maybe in recent years with the GCF and DBSA, it might be better, but historically, it's a slow process, and that won't help us reach goals by 2025 and 2030. Also, how much of that funding benefits pass through, and we need to make sure that that does pass through, because that's where the money is needed at the coalface. And I think the last 2, which is very important for me, is that how does the international climate finance that is coming in strengthen our ability to implement? And that might throw up some thorny questions. And then placing justice at the center, I listed last, but actually it's really the primary thing, as Lebo Kgang mentioned as well. We cannot see this as a tag on. Our just transition journey couldn't be a financing technology journey only. It has to embed these aspects also. And something that does need to change, and it's recognized across all developing countries, is that developing countries themselves must begin to lead these financing negotiations much more precisely. And leading implies clearly articulating our needs and clearly proposing from ourselves the terms and conditions that suit and that we're able to absorb without inhibiting our own developmental journey at the same time. I hand back to you, Lebo. Thank you for the, sorry, Mobile, thanks for the time.
Thank you very much, Chantal, for that insightful presentation on financing the just transition in South Africa. And indeed, you have raised some important issues. And at the core, justice, as you've mentioned last, is what is much more fundamental, especially in the South African context, considering our history with inequality. We need to ensure that this just transition, or this transition to the low carbon economy, addresses our socio-economic issues, namely inequality, unemployment, as well as poverty. Otherwise, it will not succeed. Otherwise, it will not be just. Otherwise, it will still leave larger people behind. We are almost out of time, ladies and gentlemen, but just to go through a few questions that we've had on the chat since the morning. We had a question in the chat about the role of nuclear. I think that came up when Dr. Kenneth Creamer was presenting, and unfortunately he's not here, but I think the chapters do cover the role of nuclear. It is covered in chapter 4, in the energy chapter. Please have a look at the book outline and also purchase the book when it comes out. I think just to give you an answer on that is that Dr. Creamer on his presentation did have he even showed a table where we saw that nuclear is quite expensive in comparison to solar and PV. And it also takes longer to implement and to build in comparison to solar and PV. So if we are transitioning and moving away from environmentally detrimental sources, we also need to be wary of nuclear. Another comment that we got from the chat this morning that was interesting was from Mike Levington about the development he suggested that, can I suggest the genuine transformative use of renewable energy is where it is integrated with water and food production, for instance, agrivoltaic projects at gigawatt scale, integration of mine wastewater treatment and renewables to create new water plants. The ownership structures, including workers, communities, where the just energy project will be located. I just wanted to highlight that because the book also covers this. We have a chapter that is centered around coal areas, specifically in Mpumalanga, trying to see what form of economic development can be implemented in such areas to ensure that the job losses that are going to occur do not wreak havoc, and that people still have a source of sustenance. And that chapter basically looks at the nexus between the energy as well as agriculture, and it positions alternative agriculture as form of employment, as well as food generation for sustenance for the local communities. So yes, we thank you, Mike, and we are very much keeping an eye on that. We are out of time for today's program, but I would like to close and thank everyone for being with us today. I would like to thank the Minister for taking time to come and share her insights today. I would like to thank all our speakers and all our authors who have contributed to this book. And finally, I would like to thank our esteemed audience for being with us today and providing insightful comments and engaging with us. And a special thanks to the MISTRA team for organizing this event, the EET, and making this event possible. We trust and believe that this book contributes immensely to the just transition pathway in South Africa, from the research, the key outcomes and policy recommendations that it provides. We will continue discussing the issues on the just transition pathway for South Africa in MISTRA's upcoming events. Please be on the lookout for that one. As you have seen in the chat function, the book is available for pre-order. Thank you very much for being with us today, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.